Greetings, this is Charles Darwin, continuing our study of the Bible, and this time we're going to actually begin the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus begins with a hero story. The hero story of Moses, but also of the people that he supposedly led from Egypt. And the story is that the Israelites made the choice of staying in Egypt because there was an easy life. They could get lots of food. Life was good there. They didn't want to go back to Palestine where they would have to herd sheep and live a Spartan lifestyle. And this was their downfall because they got enslaved by the Egyptians. Now, that's the way the story goes. Actually, it turns out there's very little historical confirmation of this outside the book of Exodus. For instance, according to archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, there are no Egyptian records of any kind of catastrophic events that led to the release of the Israelite slaves out of Egypt. As a matter of fact, there isn't even any historical record of the enslavement of the Israelites. Now, some of the people who defend the historical reliability of the Bible like to say that, well, of course you wouldn't expect the Egyptians to write down any record of the Exodus. It was embarrassing to them. But wouldn't you expect them to have written down, perhaps even boasted about having enslaved an entire nation of people? That's not there either. But you see, that's not the point. I'm not here to talk to you one way or the other about the historical reliability of the book of Exodus. That's missing the point. It's the hero story that we want to look at, the hero story of Moses and of the people of Israel. The hero story. This is something that could have started, the archetype of the story could have started 100,000 years ago around campfires of early Homo sapiens. This is a story that recurs over and over in every culture. And it's a beautiful story, and it's a meaningful story, and that's what we want to look at, the hero story of Moses. Now, one of the things that the people who put the books of the Old Testament together around 500 BC, long after the events supposedly happened, what they wanted to do was to prove their historical priority in the land. So, for instance, they wanted to say that Abraham bought some land in what would later become the nation of Israel. See, we have a right to be there because we own some of the land there. Okay? And also, that's where we came from. Now, maybe that happened and maybe it didn't happen, but it was something that the Israelites wanted to use as an argument against the other tribes that were already living in that land. Now, the hero story started with Moses and how he fled into the wilderness. He was an Israelite, he was raised in the court of Pharaoh, but he had to flee into the wilderness after he had murdered an Egyptian. So he started off, like many heroes do, as a coward. But then he was called back. According to this, God called him back to lead the people of Israel out of captivity. A very unlikely person to do that. Somebody who wasn't even there, someone who had run away. What kind of a hero was that? Well, he had to be made into a hero, and that's always part of the hero story. And according to the book of Exodus, this occurred because God spoke to Moses out of a burning bush. That there was a bush that had caught fire and it burned, but it was not consumed. Now, we all assume that this was mythology. It turns out there may have been a scientific basis for that. And that is that there are, in fact, certain shrubs in the Israelite desert and in the desert of other nearby places that will give off what are called volatile organic compounds, VOC for short. And these compounds volatilize, that is, they go into a gaseous phase. They are flammable, and what the plants are using them for is to stabilize their photosynthesis at high temperatures. But if a spark, or a match these days, is lit in the vicinity of these bushes, the volatile organic compounds in the air around the bush will burn, but the bush itself will not. Because the leaves are not flammable, but the gases that they emit are. So there may have actually been an actual event upon which the story of Moses and the burning bush was based. So Moses may have seen this, and he thought it was a sign from God to go back to the people from whom he had fled. And there's also the possibility that many of the other things that happened had a scientific basis, as we will talk about later. And then there's also, Moses had to be convinced that God was really calling him. Now, this is an essential part of the scientific process. There wasn't science as we know it back then, but when Moses thought that God was calling him, he demanded evidence. He wanted to test a hypothesis. Okay, the hypothesis that God is calling me, I'm going to test it. And so he did it twice. First, he cast his rod down on the ground and it became a serpent. He picked it back up, and the snake turned back into his walking stick. And so, of course, that's fanciful, but it was the process of demanding evidence. Also, he stuck his hand into his robe, and he pulled it out, and he had leprosy. He stuck it back in, pulled it out, and the leprosy was gone. Once again, that's fanciful, but it was a second test of the hypothesis that God is calling. These days, when preachers get on the radio or television or in front of a large audience, they just say, God told me this and God told me that. They don't bother presenting any evidence for that. They just consider their own statement to be sufficient evidence. Moses did not, according to the story. He demanded evidence. The last thing I would like to note about the beginning of the book of Exodus is that it says over and over again that Pharaoh, the leader of the Egyptians, was willing to let the Israelites go, at least to let them go temporarily. He was willing to do that, but over and over again it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Basically, God forced Pharaoh to be sinful and to suffer the consequences for it. Does this make any sense? What kind of a God would do that? Well, this brings up the problem of evil. What causes evil? And this problem, this question, is never answered in the Bible. According to some authors, you can find several different answers to that question in different books of the Old Testament. And so that's the thought that I would like to leave you with, and we'll take a closer look at the Exodus itself next time. This is Charles Darwin, Tally Ho, and Amen.